I mean,
Not everybody, but most of them.
you know,
I said not everybody.
but most people. But in
by
other words,
far the vast majority.
that's the right answer these days.
It's also what they are saying.
That's also what they are
Say.
saying. That's what I'm saying. So I'm a psychologist, of course. So what interests me is they don't want traditional gender roles. Absolutely not. Nobody wants that hunter-gatherer, nurturer, provider kind of thing. But first of all, my major question, this is why I asked about the date, if that's what they want, why aren't they fighting for it? I mean, I just don't understand this. I'm from the 60s. We wanted equality, and we fought for social change. And it's very interesting to me that if this is what they really want, then I really have a deeply, I'm looking at my psychologist, mentor, friend, colleague, Jerry Bruner, you know, why aren't they trying to make that come about in terms of the society? I mean, that psychologically is a really, really interesting question to me. Then, however, if they don't want traditional gender roles, divisions, and so forth, if they don't want, and I want to introduce this term, the gender binary. The gender binary is where being a man means not being a woman. So whatever is defined as masculine is what men do and women don't do. So the gender binary is if men provide, then women don't provide. If women care, then men don't care. Now this leads to a series of absurdities, the gender binary. A few just which you can sort of recognize is the idea that thinking is masculine and feeling is feminine, so men don't feel and women don't think. We could start with that one. I mean, you can just see, and you can see it play out throughout the society. Whatever's gendered masculine is the opposite of what's gendered feminine. Now, the other thing about the gender binary is its complement is the gender hierarchy, which is whatever is gendered masculine is valued more than whatever is gendered feminine, which, like women in, if I can introduce this term, patriarchy, is at once idealized and devalued, like activities of care. They're both idealized and they're devalued. If you want to see that playing out right now, just think about the current debate over health care. How can we afford health care? We have this enormous debt. You know, we just can't afford it. So if the government isn't going to do it, then of course, who's going to do it? Women, basically, people of color, low-income people, and so forth. When we have debates over the military budget, which is gendered masculine, nobody says, how can we afford to go into Afghanistan? We have this enormous debt, or at least not very many people are saying that. So we start to see this gender binary is playing out in society, but somehow these young people reject it, except that their fallback position falls right into the gender binary and hierarchy, which is women say, we see the hierarchy, what's valued is autonomy, what's devalued is caring, we want to be independent, we are going to work, and they end up working and caring because, of course, nobody's doing the care. So this whole family debate is very interesting because the family is not being really attended to in this family debate. The second thing we see is that men, fallback position is what Kathleen calls neo-traditionalist, which is my career comes first. And the question I think that's not being raised here and I want to introduce is the psychological question, which is that the pressures men face because success in work is also tied to questions of manhood and masculine identity. So a man whose career is sacrificed for a family has to refashion his definition or construction of masculinity away from this binary and away from the hierarchy. So we see the return of the hierarchy, the valuing of work over caring and of masculine over feminine activities in the accommodations. So that's why I'm saying this, we're committed to equality without addressing that that really means reconstructing both manhood and womanhood and deconstructing the binary and the hierarchy. So my final thing, how come the institutions aren't changing? How come? I mean, if we've all reached this kind of, we all value equality, nobody wants this gender divide, how come the institutions aren't changing? So I looked up in the index of Kathleen's book, the forbidden word, patriarchy, and it doesn't appear. So I feel like, what is, what's going on here? What is this unfinished revolution really about? And I think behind the sociological picture that's being drawn here is, first of all, a psychological dynamic that has to do with the way in which gender becomes the lever of an initiation, around issues of what constitutes manhood, what constitutes womanhood, that is based still on a binary and hierarchy, which you see as the fallback position emerging. So you have a psychological dynamic at work that has to do with the shaming around issues of manhood, and also the choice of women having seen the devaluing of those activities gendered feminine, and saying, if this hierarchy is in operation, I choose top over bottom. I mean, basically, it's a sort of logical choice. So that's the first thing. But the second thing, and this is my final point, is there's a political dynamic going on here. And the political dynamic, and to my mind, the unfinished revolution, is the fight between democracy and patriarchy, where what characterizes patriarchy, the DNA of patriarchy, its building blocks are the gender binary and hierarchy, which are fundamentally anti-democratic. That is the division of human qualities into masculine and feminine, so that you have this idea that, men work and women care, so you can't see that women are working and men are caring, that kind of thing, or all those things. And also the hierarchy. So the unfinished revolution, which is the revolution that I think started in the 60s, which was the movement, it was the civil rights movement, it was the anti-war movement that started within the military, taking on this notion that to be a man meant to be a soldier, or to at least to be ready to be a soldier, and the women's movement, the feminist movement, which to me is one of the great historic movements in human history, because what I think feminism is it's not a question, an issue of women or of men, or a battle between women and men, but feminism is the movement to free democracy from patriarchy. That's why it deconstructs the gender binary, it rejects the gender hierarchy. And what is standing in the way of this change on an institutional level is a sort of subtle, it's not named, that's why I think it's not talked about, is the pushback of patriarchy against this greater move toward democracy which started in the 60s. So what interests me about this generation is, you see, my generation, which was the 60s generation, where we took a lot of risks, and at least at the time, we really fought for civil rights and to end atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons, and for the women's movement and the anti-war movement and the gay liberation movement, is the belief that people could affect the society, that you could bring about social change. I mean, we thought we ended a war and all of this kind of thing. Why haven't this is a slightly different generation, why haven't the children of this generation incorporated that belief and that vision? And that's the question I really have, because otherwise the statement of values seems to me rather superficial, and it leaves a kind of mystification. If they've rejected this, why is the fallback position falling into these familiar binaries and, in a way, hierarchies? And if this is what everyone wants, why isn't it happening? So to end with Obama, change we can believe in. I mean, I think that the unfinished revolution is really the revolution to free democracy from patriarchy, and the family is obviously at the center, at the core of that revolution.
One quick response to that, which is just to keep in mind that it is exactly this generation that got Obama elected. I'm trying to hold my tongue till my final chance, but I did want to just say to keep in mind that it is this generation that worked for Obama that was a major part in bringing.
Well, because I think they believe that he
Right.
would bring about this
Well,
institutional change. I mean,
Exactly. So we'll talk about that. I just want to defend these kids
I will
against
exercise
that.
my moderator.
Thank you. I'm aware of the time, so I'll try to go a little quickly. Of course, this is always the problem of going last, that now I want to tear this up and respond to what everyone else has said, but I'll try to stick a little bit with what I thought about earlier. I would like to begin by saying that this book is a marvelous read, and I think it's worth saying that I read a lot of social science. I'm sure we all do. It's a remarkably vivid portrait of this generation, and it's not the type of methodology that I use. I think many of us, I'm sort of a policy analyst, number cruncher. I do read a fair amount of qualitative research, but I do just want to say, I encourage those of you who haven't to read it. The 120 young people that Kathleen interviewed really jump off the page, and you have made them, I think, she has made them extremely vivid in a series of really very small extractions of what were obviously complicated interviews. I found myself, I was telling Kathleen, which I very rarely do when I'm reading sociology, I was sitting on my sofa responding to them. Amanda, I would say, how could you say that? And Brianna, that's a ridiculous choice. So of course, the first conclusion was social scientists should be quite grateful I don't do this kind of research. But I did wonder, Kathleen, in all seriousness, after you turned the tape recorder off, if you gave them the speech that I think Carol would have given them, and I was itching to give them as well. I was. Get off your ass and do something here. So, okay.
I would say that for someone who's not known for being able to keep my mouth shut, it's very good. It's a good test of my abilities that I can sit there and listen to how other people see the world without just telling them how they should.
It is really one interesting, provocative, compelling, sympathetic, annoying comment after the next. And it's a remarkably varied portrait, and it comes through. Of course, it's embedded in some very fine theoretical analysis as well. I really want to say two things in general that are both about public policy, which indeed is my area of work. A lot of us in the work and family world, we come from many different disciplines. There's a large world of economists, policy analysts, sociologists, obviously, psychologists as well. I work mostly at the crossroads of policy analysis, economics, and sociology. And what I want to say in the policy literature, there's a very big policy literature on what we call work-family reconciliation policy, the types of policies that enable people to balance work and family in all the ways that Kathleen's subjects were talking about. And there's also a large literature on the design of public policy that's compatible with sort of equal sharing, with gender egalitarian divisions of labor in domestic work and paid work. I write a lot in that literature as well, and I read it. There is extremely little empirical work there, and it's even rarely reviewed, on the question of what is it that people actually want? What are people's hopes and aspirations? And of course, we know that's hard to tap. There are all kinds of social desirability questions. There are issues about behavior and stated preferences being different, and of course we know all that. But there's really very little, and in fact it's often said in the policy literature, we sort of throw our hands up and we say, well, actually we don't really know what people want or what their intrinsic hopes and dreams are, or what they would do in a different world. And so the answer to the question is often supplied in an ideologically driven way that policy analysts typically take a position on, basically whether women and men in fact do want to share and share alike, or whether they don't. So as I said, although there's not there's a literature that even asks what are the constraints, what are the institutional constraints that prevent more equal divisions of labor basically at work and at home. But again, we rarely ask, do people want that? The way the question is sometimes asked is, what in fact would divisions of labor be were the world different? And I wrote a book that was mentioned in that kind introduction in 2003 called Families That Work, and we took up this question quite a bit. One that's asked a lot is, suppose we imagined a world with a generous work-family reconciliation package that allowed people to balance work and family, that allowed people to share more equally. Imagine we know what would a revolutionized workforce look like. A lot of writing about this, a workforce that understood that people were encumbered and the flexibility. What would a world look like if, there was a relaxation of gender role expectations, would men and women as groups, in fact, share paid work and unpaid work 50-50? There are two answers, basically, in the policy literature, I would say rather stylized. One view, which is really what I've written mostly in the past, is that men and women have fundamentally the same preferences as groups, the same preferences, desires, and aspirations, and then heterosexual couples would, in general, share equally. As we say in the literature, they would halve it all if the world would allow them to do so, and that's a big theme, I think, Kathleen, in your book. There's, of course, an opposite perspective. This is stylizing. Men and women are fundamentally different with respect to caregiving and the balance between domestic engagement and work, with women leaning to home and men leaning, of course, to paid work, and therefore institutional change would, in fact, make little difference. The first perspective argues if you remove the constraints, we'll see this convergence. So I want to just tell a very short story of how this, in some sense, how wanting these two approaches are without the richness of the work, I think, that you've just done. When my book came out in 2003, it came out almost simultaneously with a book by James Q. Wilson called The Marriage Problem. Some of you may have seen in 2002, the political scientist who sort of visited this field of the study of marriage rather briefly. I wrote that, I made a case in my book for egalitarian sharing, basically, which I argued was, of course, it's normative in the end, but I argued that it was based in a lot of literature on what was really sort of good for families, for men, women, and for children. He argued in his book against equal divisions of sharing and described the idea that men and women wanted to or would or could share equally as groups as folly and as the fantasy of privileged academic researchers such as, I'll get there in a minute, such as myself. So the two books were, of course, quite different. The American Prospect, which I'm sure many of you know, a somewhat progressive journal on social policy, I've done a fair amount of writing for them. They asked us to have a 4-installment debate. I debated Professor Wilson on the question about egalitarian marriage. And in the end, the debate was not, we left the policy argument aside fundamentally. I might just add, by the way, that his argument about marriage is the following. He's become an adherent to the ideas, the fundamental ideas of evolutionary psychology rather late in life. And he argued, not a new argument, but that we really need marriage in society essentially to institutionalize men, to tame men, and to slow them down in their unending necessity to sort of spread their sperm indiscriminately. So, in other words, men are not angels, and these institutions will help to rein them in. So he does believe in the impact of institutions on gendered behavior, although I might add not my institutions, but in any case. So he took me on in the debate quite critically for saying, where did this idea that men and women really are fundamentally the same come from? That isn't this my vision? My co-authors and my vision, aren't we imposing this on a world of policy analysis? And I argued essentially, I read Sarah Hardy and I read a lot of psychology and as much as I could, and I argued ultimately that I would say I still believe this, I don't think we know what men and women would do in an entirely different context. If we really had this world in which sex role expectations were relaxed, workplaces were different, and the public policy package that I've been writing about for so long were available, I said I don't think we know. He said we do know that men and women are really fundamentally different. So in the end of the debate, I said, well, let's try this. Why don't we implement these changes that I'm suggesting, which was mostly a generous package of childcare, paid family leave, and an extensive bundle of working time regulations, which is the subject of my own work. Why don't we implement them and let 100 years pass? And then we'll see. And if at the end of 100 years, the gender divisions of labor are not, in fact, closer to 50-50, then I'm wrong and we'll reorganize. So he wrote back, 100 years, at my age, I don't buy green bananas. So, the point of this is, this was not particularly my finest moment intellectually. It certainly wasn't his, but that's about as good as it gets in the policy literature. So I think that I really do mean to say that to really take on this question of not just what do people want, and I think we all know that what people, especially the economist in me, that what people say they want, what does that really mean in terms of preferences is a tricky question. But what I think is really paradigm shifting, if I might, in Kathleen's work, is not just really taking on this question of what do people want and getting such a rich and complicated narrative that is, in the end, very clear, but families are dynamic, people are dynamic, nothing is static, things change. But I think what the piece that really screams out of the book is this notion of people having sort of a first preference and then a set of fallbacks. And that's really what we're talking about. And it's really a new way of thinking about this. So people have aspirations, and then they quickly realize, usually before Kathleen is interviewed, that I might add, that those aspirations, they're constrained by the world in which they live, and therefore they do something else. And that something else is what we witness. In fact, you do